first, let's get some questions from the audience. My first question for you, if you are writing a novel that involves oppression, please raise your hand. So we've got a good mix of people. If you are writing and you have kind of a character who's a freedom fighter or a group that's trying to defeat your oppression in your society, in your novel, please raise your hand. So we've got a lot of people that are working on defeating. We're asking that because I hope that as we go through, we're going to talk about some tools on why oppression exists. How do you build a dictator or build oppression into society, but also how do we defeat it? How can we build strong characters that can help kids, help readers understand how they can defeat oppression that they see around them and how to defeat oppression in their society and build something better. And so I think a great place to start is who we are. Mickey, can you start?
Sure. I'm Mickey Helmer. I am a young adult author. I primarily write fantasy. I have a short story coming out, an LGBT retelling of Sleeping Beauty coming out in a Fractured Fairy Tale anthology called Fractured Sleep in the next month or so. I don't know when it's coming out. I should know. But I'm also LGBT, so I'll be your rainbow. Here. Hey guys, who were here from the panel earlier. I see you.
Hi, my name is Aaron Paulette. I run a charity called Operation Blazing Sword. As you may have noticed, I am transgender, so I have some view of oppression. And what Operation Blazing Sword does is we help queer people who are in fear of their lives, especially after Pulse, if they want to learn how to defend themselves, but they don't know where to start. I pair them up with volunteers, with trainers who will teach them how to defend themselves, primarily with firearms, but we have other trainers as well. And so I believe that if you know how to defend yourself, it's not proof against being oppressed, but it's a lot harder to oppress you if you can fight back.
And my name is Shannon Babb. I'm a full-time scientific educator, but I also have APD, so I have a disability, which means I am reading your lips. So when you ask questions, if I can't see your mouth, I just didn't hear you. So that's a hint. Let's start out with the question that helps give us a definition. What do you see the definition of oppression?
So for me, it's anything that's limiting my mobility, either, and mobility can be anything that's anything I'm trying to speak, anything I'm trying to feel, anything I'm trying to believe. Let's see, I wrote down all these notes for you guys. It can be, personal, interpersonal, institutional, cultural. For me, it's anything that limits freedom of expression, or it's along those lines. I think I could go a little bit deeper, but I think we're going for just a broad view.
Well, my view of oppression is a little more basic, and I look at if someone is oppressed, then their rights are being denied, and they are enslaved, they are second-class citizens, they are living under threat of death, of torture, and so just as an example, when I look at the queer community here in America, compared to the rest of the world, we have it great because we are not under death sentence for being queer. We do not face jail time for expressing same-sex love, and that's like that in large portions of this world. And so that to me is really that oppressive when you don't have human rights accorded to you because of your gender, your sexuality, your religion, things like that. That's really what gets me.
So we can usually break them into broad categories where different systems are put into place to basically keep people from reaching their full potential. What are some of the categories that different societies have used to oppress sections of their population?
So when you say category, you're saying like race, religion, or...
We can go that direction. We can go law versus societal, cultural norms. Where would you guys like to take it?
I think those are all good places. Some of them are like systems of oppression, like justice system is both a system of liberation and a system of oppression, because it's limiting you and saying you cannot do these things because like it would be bad to go steal that guy's stuff. That's his stuff. But then it says things like, well, what was she wearing? And they ask that question in court, and then they make a decision or a judgment based on what was she wearing. And so when I'm looking at these categories of oppression, I think they're intertwined. I don't think that you can say, well, we're gonna limit this race, but there's also other factors at play to recognize. So for one thing, for me, in order for oppression to exist, it has to have two things. It has to be pervasive, which means it has to be a lot of it. And this is the same thing. You're gonna hear this definition. This is actually the legal definition of sexual harassment. It needs to be, or like a hostile work environment. It's one, it needs to be pervasive, which means it needs to happen for a lot of people. So a majority needs to feel that there's a problem. We feel that in America there is a majority problem because and a lot of people know this, that a lot of LGBT people have problems coming out of the closet. I've never been at LTUE as a lesbian before this weekend or before this morning, and I had a panic attack driving here because I'm wearing a rainbow shirt and I wasn't sure that that was appropriate or if I would come under physical harm. That is pervasive oppression. The second is it needs to create a hostile space. So one, I am feeling if I come here wearing a rainbow t-shirt, I'm going to be in possible physical trouble. I might receive bodily harm for just attempting to present as something that I am. And so if you have those two things, you're definitely oppressed. Those are checkboxes you can go through, and that's also for your workspace, for your religion, for any institution, school you attend. If that is happening, you are in a hostile environment for an oppressed person, and that could be from it could be gender, it could be sexual orientation, it could be race, it could be religion. So like, I'm an ex-Mormon, sorry, it's just not possible. It's really hard to be Mormon and gay at the same time, you guys. And so in that case, you go to Mormon church, you cannot, it fulfills the rules. It is pervasive, you cannot be gay there. 2, it is hostile. If you are gay, we will kick you out. Or if you present as gay or if you act upon gayness, we will kick you out. And so for those kind of things, so that's where, oppression starts to have interplay between different systems. So, in the 70s, you could not go to, you could not find accurate representation for a gay person or a woman, sometimes even a man, in a judicial
vulnerable, whereas the men who have physical strength are constantly going and doing things all the time. That creates a natural power imbalance. And so the women, when they're pregnant, become dependent upon the men to go out and hunt. And that unfortunately just perpetuates through the ages until advancements in technology and society have managed to mostly square that off. Of course, this is America. You really just need to look at some of the hardcore countries. I'm not trying to stir shit. Excuse me, but the point I'm making is that if you look at, okay, you can only go out with a chaperone, you can only show this much of your face, you can't drive, you can't vote. That's really bad oppression, and
well,
that's just something that's been baked into our DNA, I think.
Well, I'm not sure it's baked into our DNA. I have feelings about that, but
I was
What
trying
you
to
make-
end it quickly so I didn't talk over you.
You're so nice.
Right, okay, what I was getting at, it was more like that was the survival structure for so long, and even when we didn't need it to survive, it just kept going through tradition. So maybe not DNA, but cultural, sociological, that sort of thing.
Yes, absolutely. But when you're talking about it, it's something that's pervasive and hostile. And you've just given us a really good example that if I were to go out in certain countries and try and drive a car, I might be injured for that or jailed because I had tried to have access to a vehicle and move places. So that's really interesting, and if I can just hijack a minute. But when you're talking about cars are a mode of transportation, and one way of oppressing anyone is to limit their ability to move. So if you can say,
Papieren bitte.
yes, can you please translate?
Oh, that's German for papers, please.
Yes.
And
Exactly.
and so yes, okay, we've already invoked Hitler here, but yes, that was an excellent modern day example of how to oppress both an ethnic minority and a religion, and you start by denying them rights. You start by denying them the ability to defend themselves, by denying them the ability to move. Pretty soon, okay, well, we don't want you to own shops anymore, and so on and so forth until, you know what, we don't want you in society at all, and we're just going to deny you the right to live.
I wrote down a list that's almost exactly that, and it's like a list of instructions, and I can't believe how easy it was to write this list and to say, here's how I'm going to start from just the very, very basic. No, let's assume there's no oppression at all. We're gonna create oppression because, like as a dictator or someone who wants power, you need to, in order to do that, you have to take power from somewhere. You have to subjugate someone. You can't just say I'm going to dictate and everyone will, fall in. There has to be an interplay of different things, like I'm taking things, rights away. And you can see this in, like, if you start researching any sort of cult. Johnstown was a big one. That's a good one to look at, like where they just started taking Jonestown. Thank you. Where they started taking people and just kind of collecting them and then like shaving off their relationships and limiting their movements and that kind of thing. But it starts out very, very, very minute and very subtle. So, and here's how it happens. So, this is where you write things down, I think. Maybe. One, you're going to make a thing, so a trait, a subject, an activity, socially undesirable. So, this is not a government thing yet. This is just a, hey, maybe I'm whispering on the street. People who eat jerky, that is just like jerky is stinky. I don't like jerky.
Can I interrupt just briefly?
Yes.
All right, I've talked about this before, and this is something that I call othering. It's where you dehumanize a group of people so that you don't regard them as human, you regard them as the other. Because we as human beings have a hard time hurting other human beings. It's why in various schools where you're taught to survive being taken hostage, one of the things they tell you is to connect with your captor, make eye contact, tell them your name, tell them something about yourself, because you become a person in their eyes, and it is very hard to hurt a person. It is very, very easy to hurt a thing, an obstacle. For example, driving in rush hour traffic. The car in front of you, that is not a person, is it? That's a car. And they cut you off. And I can guarantee that practically everyone in here has experienced that one moment of murderous rage where they've gone, if I could, I would just obliterate that car. Because you don't see it as a human being behind the wheel. It's an obstacle. And obstacles can be destroyed because they have no feelings. And so when you dehumanize, when you other, you create that divorce between this over here looks and acts like a person, but trust me, they're not. And here's why. Go.
Yes, well, and it's exactly that. It's the social thing that we're making this thing socially unacceptable. It's socially unacceptable to what do the Egyptians do? They wipe their hands on their hair after dinner. So they had been eating chicken. What they did is their hair was their napkin. Today you would be like, my gosh, what did you just do? I'm going to become physically ill. You need to be removed from society because you're a nasty walking parasite with grease that you took from your chicken fingers to your hair, you nasty. So like that's one cultural shift. But what I'm talking about is to oppress someone or to dominate them, right? Or to make them less than. You're taking away subtle things. And you're starting with these tiny things, and they get bigger and bigger. So you're starting with the idea of, hey, maybe bar mitzvahs are too noisy. And that's, how subtle is that? That's just saying someone's making a lot of noise at their party. Well, later that becomes, through time, it becomes, we don't like Jews. Maybe. But like if I were to start oppressing, and that's clearly not how it happened, guys, don't quote me on it. But it's just an example of what you might do in your own writing if you're trying to create a dictatorship. And the hard part about some of us in this group is that we're trying to create these systems where a hero can arise and come up and triumph over all, right? So there has to be levels of problem, these social problems, and I think it starts out at that small level, and then it gets a little bit bigger. Like maybe this person who's trying to, oppress the minority or oppress the majority, starts inducing some laws after that, and these laws get approved. They start a conversation. Well, hey, yeah, maybe I don't like that kind of group of people. Maybe I'm not fond of that. And then things will escalate. On the social level, violence will then happen. So you'll see violence in the streets, and then the next level will be the violence is then reciprocated by or continued by the governing body. So police, if you're writing a medieval fantasy, it would be the City Watch from Game of Thrones. They are now perpetuating the violence that started as a small opinion.
Well,
right?
By the way, I'm Amanda.
Oh, hey guys, this is Amanda.
I'm sorry I'm late. I was at the Faux restaurant and they were taking forever to bring my bill. This violence and oppression usually doesn't start without a social and economic reason, though. To go back to the example of the Jews in World War II, there was a very clear economic reason to target the Jews. The Jews were legally prohibited for several generations from working in any other industry but banking in Germany. Therefore, they worked in banking, because you have to work, you have to pay the bills, right? But Germany had just lost World War I. The entire country was broke because of the Treaty of Versailles and these high taxes that were levied to pay for the war reparations under the Treaty of Versailles. It's very easy for people to look and go, all of these rich bankers, which very quickly becomes all of these rich Jews. And add in a little bit of, if they hadn't taken what was rightfully ours, the rest of us wouldn't be so poor.
What's that emotion that's attached to that? That's like indignation.
It's indignation, it's envy, but it's a very easy thing to do when you have the right economic and political environment to do it in. You can look at all throughout history, and there's countless examples. The French Revolution, the aristocrats, hang all the aristos in the streets. I mean, the streets ran red with blood from the guillotine for years. You've had it in Maoist China. You've had it in the USSR. Any social situation in which you have a large group of poor, somewhat oppressed people, probably oppressed by traditional social mores, but more oppressed by pure, simple economics. If you have one group that does not seem to be as affected as the rest of the groups, it's really easy to make everybody hate that group. It doesn't, in your writing, it doesn't have to necessarily be an ethnic group, a gender, a species. All you have to have is one group who seems to be a little bit better off than everybody else, and a couple of rabble-rousers to start the movement.
Would it be safe to say that, obviously not all, but most oppression is rooted in humanity's need to blame someone else for their problems?
No, Most oppression is rooted in humanity's basic instinct to oppress somebody else. We're great apes with higher order intellect, and hierarchies are naturally evolving. Everywhere.
And I would say that oppression comes from maybe like greed. I want something that maybe you have or that you're keeping from me, and so I'm going to take that from you, and then it's a calculated way in which to do it. So
I mean, but that's who here has middle school age girls, or is currently a middle school age girl? Okay. Take any group of 20 girls around the same age, put them in a room together, give it an hour. You will have a social leader. You will have one person who is on top, and then you will have a naturally evolving hierarchy from there. Take 20 boys from the same age group, put them in a room together. Within an hour, you will have one person who is the social leader. Move all of these people apart, give it another hour, and they may not even remember one another. Hierarchies are naturally evolving. It's not necessarily oppression as we think of it. It becomes oppression the minute that there is an economic or social reason to have it. And honestly, some people are just evil.
Well,
maybe we do have our antagonists.
I think that brings us back to the point, what all of us are discussing and kind of beating around the bush is oppression and hierarchies are about power. Now that power may be money, but your society that you're writing may not have a monetary value system. They may have a different type of cultural value system that they're using for stacking their hierarchy.
It's like a currency, like.
There's a social currency. Monkeys have social currencies that they use. A lot of animals do.
Mm-hmm. This is very true. But I wonder if on currencies we could say that currency isn't just money. It could be like influence. It could be how many resources is my land currently sitting on? How many resources can I protect with the current force at hand? Like on a rebel force, it would be like how many resources can I steal or destroy of the enemy? You know, something like that.
All currency is a marker for a unit of value.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the paper dollar is just merely a more efficient way of deciding that we're not going to trade, say, eggs for a side of beef.
So,
I have like 12 eggs right now.
we have just gone through how to basically build your dictator, how to make sure that your society is a terrible place to live. Let's flip the coin. How do we break this? How do we help our heroes? Gain some of that power back? How do we make a more equitable society in our stories?
Aaron, you start.
No, please. I'm still composing my answer.
Okay. Most counter-revolutionary movements, if you want to think of them that way,
I like that word. It's a good word.
are started by low-level social organization. Now, very secret low-level social organization, but you need people to be disgruntled to a certain extent. If the vast majority of your society is quite happy living in the oppressive and evil society, you will find no support. Look at the American Revolution as a really good example of this. There were only about 3% of the country at any given time actually fought in the war, like actually picked up arms and went and fought. But about 10% of the country provided logistical support, and a larger percentage of that actually hid the organizers of the revolution. So in any given society in which you are organizing against the oppressive force, you need a certain percentage of the society willing to lie about you, willing to hide you,
Like, willing to lie on behalf of.
willing to lie to the authorities that they saw nothing, they heard nothing, they know nothing. Whether they're doing this because they care about you personally, whether they're doing this because they really hate the guy in charge, or because they believe that what you are going to offer them is better than what the current establishment is offering them. really makes no difference. All that matters is that they are willing to lie on your behalf to the authorities. They have to hide you. You need a certain percentage of people who are willing to provide you logistical support. That means food, money, water, weapons, all of the things you need to build a growing, healthy revolution. You need a leader. You need somebody who is just as charismatic as the guy who is currently in charge.
Or, I will add to that, charismatic or fictionally charismatic, as in
Yes.
we think that they're charismatic, or the general populace thinks that they have and I'm going to use Legend from Mary Lou's book, because, you know, that kid, he is not impressive, but his legend is.
Yeah, all you need is somebody for people to rally behind. You need a figurehead.
A figurehead, that's a good word for it.
They don't have to actually do anything,
and-
by the way. Just be there. And then you need people who have the intelligence and the ruthlessness to be able to actually organize a military fighting force against the current leadership.
So this is very big picture, like very, what is the word? What's the movie with not Braveheart? He's like, he does the thing. It's a gift, freedom. And there's Braveheart. Oh gosh, I have a horse that's Braveheart. Anyway, so it's like that. That's very big. It's very epic. And I'm thinking of things on a smaller scale, like close first person POV kind of stuff, where maybe like in the book The Hate You Give, you know, you have a very individual experience where a person is oppressed and they no longer can handle it and they are done being oppressed. And they've reached the point where oppression and my willingness or character's willingness to accept the oppression or to live underneath it are no longer passable. They can't work. That word is impasse. Right?
But you don't have to have that on a large scale. Who here
Right, and
reads
that's like
Pratchett?
small scale, right?
Pratchett? Anybody? Tiffany Akins. Remember the scene where Tiffany Akins in the first book of that series, the monster comes out of the river and tries to grab her brother. She doesn't want to watch her brother. She doesn't want to be a cheesemaker's daughter. She's tired of everything. And she goes, gets the frying pan out of the kitchen, and smacks the monster in the face with it. She really doesn't have any real thing against this monster, again, other than what is it doing in my river with my brother? She stood up to oppression. The real oppression she stood up to is her own very oppressive life, represented by the monster that has popped out of the river. As this goes on, it becomes more epic because, of course, it's Pratchett, that's how it works. But the small acts of oppression are, I'm done. Anybody who has ever told your boss, I quit, I'm done, and then packed up your stuff and left.
So we're kind of seeing the difference between the epic fantasy. We've kind of got the Tolkien-sized, where you've got the organization and everything underneath, but on the other side, you have the much more human stories. We've got the Pratchett examples. Those are it's the I'm not going to give up my seat on the bus type stories. Both are valuable. Some of you, as authors, are probably going to lean towards non-violent solutions to oppression or the violent. And different forms of oppression are going to kind of lead your story down different paths.
You mentioned nonviolent, and what I was getting from hearing all these is that I feel, if we're specifically talking about overthrowing your dictator, you will have greater effect if there is a philosophy behind it. Because if people are doing it because they want money, because life sucks, they only have to achieve this much in order to go, okay, well, my life is better now. Why am I risking my life? If you want someone to go to their death, you need to get them to believe in something greater than themselves. And it could be something as simple as, I believe in my country, and I'll die to defend it. or it could be something complex and moral, like whatever is happening to these people is wrong, and I will not allow it. And there are, in fact, peaceful ways, as we've been talking about violence. But let's talk about Gandhi. Gandhi in India. And he did a very peaceful revolution against English oppression. Now, the reason this worked is because England, even though it was running roughshod over India, still regarded itself as a moral country. They regarded itself as a Christian country. And what Gandhi was doing was throwing their morals back in their face. Now, if Gandhi had tried this against, say, the Nazis, they would have said, we don't care, pow. And that would have been it. There are ways to peacefully resist, but you are basically dependent upon the morals, the ethics, the goodwill of the people you are defying.
Yeah, I think there's a note about rules that you have set up for your own work to sneak in there. Like if you've set up these rules for your culture, then the rules are we live on violence. It would be okay to shoot someone in the head, or no, this is not how, this is very pacifist sort of culture. It would be very inappropriate to do that, and it would be unthinkable. And depending on your rules, that would be where pacifism would be acceptable and morally right. Whereas, like in American culture, the morally right thing to do is like guns blazing. We're going to protect everyone. And some of those war movies you see.
That's true and not, actually. Martin Luther King was completely nonviolent, and it worked because the people that he was protesting against regarded him as human. And really, honestly, the social time was ripe for change. You had the two disparate groups who were starting to merge more and more, and it becomes, as Aaron was saying when I was walking in very rudely and late, it's hard to other people that you actually interact with. Two disparate groups were starting to interact more and more, and it was becoming very difficult to other them. But the legal system is a hard thing to change. Anybody who's ever tried to fight a traffic ticket knows that. But it works. You can have a non-violent system like Gandhi or like Martin Luther King, as long as your opponent recognizes you as human.
I'm so sorry. No heads.
And you have to realize one side was nonviolent in those. The people who were trying to change the system were nonviolent. That does not mean that there wasn't violence in the transition. There was a lot of violence in both of those transitions, and acknowledging that is important.
Yeah, and you're going to have that anytime there's conflict between humans. And honestly, the violence on the part of the English in Gandhi's system, or in Gandhi's example, and the government in the example of Martin Luther King, was the point. It was publicly, you are making martyrs. And the people who were getting arrested at protest, or getting beaten by cops in Martin Luther King's example, or getting killed by English soldiers in Gandhi's example, were doing so very publicly, very openly, on camera and on film, which was then distributed to the public to sway public opinion. Always remember that your character is not just fighting a military war. They are fighting a political war, and the media is part of that. What helped Martin Luther King make a difference, and Gandhi, was turning the political tide by showing an innocent man, an innocent, well-dressed man or woman, being beaten savagely by armed soldiers.
So we're getting close to the end, but I'd like to have a little bit of time for questions. We have a question right there.
What do you do when the oppressed group isn't seen as human? They're alien, they're AI, they're something that isn't human, and so that aspect doesn't come into play.
either make themselves human by integrating more, or you're looking at a war of extermination between two peoples.
Well, if one of the groups, excuse me, if the people doing the oppressing are humans, I'd like to point out that humans have an amazing ability to anthropomorphize inanimate objects, and we will pack bond. We look at our pets and we imbue them with human characteristics. And so if your situation is how do we get humans to recognize this other species, start drawing parallels. Okay, well, humans, they nurture their young in this particular way. Well, look, we as a species, we do something very similar. And try and draw that parallel so that hopefully the pack bonding and anthropomorphic urges of humans will take over.
Or if your subspecies, as it were, sells things that are needed or provides a service that is needed, they are in a perfect situation to interact and make themselves more sympathetic.
Okay, we've got Hannah in the front, and then we have a gal in the orange shirt that will go after that.
Is it ever in a situation where the oppressor is actually doing a good thing? Like, are the rebels ever wrong?
Star Wars, all of Star Wars.
The thing about the oppressors is they're always the heroes in their own story. They are convinced that they are doing the right thing.
Well, we're writing, right? And so there's always both parts, and you hear this characterization, and this is going to apply heavily, is that your villains see themselves as the hero of their own story, right? So in order to make your oppressors seem like they think they're the heroes of their own story, you must make them seem that real. So you will have to find traits, actions, your character, your world rules, and make sure that those all mesh together for your oppressor to exist. So I don't want your oppressor or your hero to just suddenly come out of a world that doesn't make sense for that person to not exist there either. So I would definitely give them both equal attention when you're drafting them and when you're planning for them or you're going through in your editing process to make sure that they're believable and that they make sense.
Good example, when I mentioned Star Wars. Okay, so the Sith, as it were, it sounds like they don't make any sense, right? Except for you had a lot of political instability at the beginning, and you had the Jedi who were a very large organizational structure with a lot of political power. So in the beginning, the Sith, when you go and look at the prequels, the Sith were kind of the revolutionary movement, right? Were they wrong to take down the Jedi? From their perspective, no. Did they bring greater order and therefore more security? From their perspective, probably yes. That's what I mean by when I say all of Star Wars. You had two sides that both really honestly were trying to do the right thing for the most people. They just had very different ideas of what the right thing was.
The question in the back?
Okay, I was going to ask, this is especially for more fantasy-like context, but what do you do when the oppressed species is legitimately dangerous in some way? Either like because of like magic or other things, like there's a reason why people are afraid of them, but it's still not good for them to be oppressed, but like how do you deal with that without having problematic implications?
Two-state solution.
What?
Two-state solution. The only way, if you actually legitimately want a peaceful outcome to that, they have to, and one group is legitimately dangerous to the other, you have to separate the two groups.
I'm going to counter that and say absolutely not. Make them marry each other. No, I have a good
Actually,
example.
that's a good point.
It depends on what your outcome is and what the tone and mood of your story is set up for. So if the mood of your story is going to be something that doesn't end happily, then maybe you need a division. It might not be advisable in today's current cultural climate because that's what will get you called out on Twitter and I don't want that to happen to you. So I would take a very careful look at making sure. I'm going to recommend a book to you specifically. It is called Hawk Song. It's about 40,000 words by Amelia Atwater Rhodes. And anybody else read it? You're my favorite people. Okay, so in that series, you have people who shapeshift into hawks and people who shapeshift into serpents, and they have been killing each other for hundreds of years. The only way they found to fix things was the serpent guy said, "Hey, hawk princess, will you please marry me?" And she's like, "Oh, heck no!" And then maybe it works.
So what's the recommendation again? The title?
It's called Hawk Song, and you can come talk to me about that after if you like to.
So
We're limited.
We'll take 2 rapid fire questions and then that's going to be it. So Grayson and then you.
And what about long-term oppression, like something that's become the norm?
Slavery was the norm for all of humanity right up until it wasn't. When there is a social or political or economic reason for things to start changing to where it stops looking normal and starts looking like oppression, there will be a reason for somebody to start resisting it.
I have one more recommendation for that. I'll post it on my Facebook or my Twitter, but there's a document from Vanderbilt University that talks about allies, and it specifically discusses the process of someone becoming an ally and seeing the oppressed race as no longer something to be oppressed. Also, race is a pigment of your imagination.
So last question.
So since oppression is a real world issue for a lot of people, is there any suggestions you have for making sure that people don't feel like you're trivializing oppression by writing entertainment about it?
Sensitivity readers, more than one. So don't go and say, I have an LGBT character, I'm going to go to my gay friend. No. Go to like his friend and then like find his girlfriends and then like all their friends and maybe have like 10 people read it and listen. And this is the key word. Listen to what they tell you, because they're going to say something and you're going to be like, that's not true. No, everything they say is valid and true, and you need to make sure that you're not making mistakes.
Sometimes you have to make entertainment in order to get people to look at the problem from a different viewpoint. Classic example, the 1960s Star Trek, Let That Be Your Last Battlefield, where you've got the alien whose face is black on one side and white here, and he's being chased by the guy with the black here and the white here, maybe we've got it backwards. Okay, we look at it now, and it is so obviously a critique of racism in the 60s during the Civil Rights Movement. And it's blunt, we get the point. But back then, it was a divisive topic to talk about, well, maybe we shouldn't have segregation. So we'll do a fantasy version of these races that have a black and white face, and that's suddenly safe to talk about because it's not real. It's absurd, but it gets people talking and thinking in the right direction. And just before we wrap up, I want to recommend to you a book. It's called Rules for Radicals by Saul Alinsky. You may not like the politics behind it, but it is a very interesting guide on how to run a movement for change. So if you're trying to overthrow a tyrannical government in your story, you might get some good ideas there.
Thank you so much for coming.